Dining room went completely silent the moment my son-in-law looked his regional director in the eye and said, "Oh, don't mind him. That's just Audrey's father. He's been retired for years. Doesn't really do much of anything anymore." I was standing 3 feet away, close enough to hear every word. Close enough to see the director's eyes flick toward me with that particular expression people get when they're deciding whether someone is worth their time. I smiled, extended my hand, and said nothing. That was the night everything changed, not because I lost my temper, not because I made a scene at my daughter's carefully planned dinner party, but because I finally understood exactly who my son-in-law was, and I realized I had been far too patient for far too long. My name is Gordon. Wait, I need to choose carefully here. Let me call myself what my grandkids call me, Grandpa Marsh. My full name is Marshall Clifford Webb, and I am 63 years old, recently widowed. And until that dinner party, I had been doing everything in my power to give my son-in-law the benefit of the doubt. My daughter Audrey married Colton Pierce 4 years ago in a small ceremony outside of Kelowna, British Columbia. It was a beautiful September afternoon, vineyards in the background, sun low and golden the way it gets out there in early fall. My late wife Sandra cried through the whole thing. I kept it together mostly, until Audrey looked back at me before walking down the aisle and mouthed, "Thank you, Dad." That got me. Colton was 31 then. Sharp dresser. Good handshake. Worked in regional sales for a mid-sized logistics company headquartered in Vancouver. He had that particular brand of confidence that reads as charm until you live close enough to see what's underneath it. I never disliked him. That's important to say. I genuinely tried. Sandra liked him well enough. She said he reminded her of her brother Owen in the early days, before Owen found himself. She meant it as a compliment mostly. The trouble started quietly, the way it always does. When Sandra got sick, pancreatic cancer, November of the year after the wedding, Colton was sympathetic in the right ways and absent in the important ones. He sent a flower arrangement to the hospital that cost more than it needed to and visited exactly twice in 4 months. Audrey drove out every weekend. I was there nearly every day. When Sandra passed the following March, Colton gave a toast at the small gathering afterward that lasted 6 minutes and managed to be mostly about himself, about how losing a mother-in-law had taught him the importance of family. I noticed I didn't say anything. That was my first mistake. Over the next 2 years, I watched my son-in-law slowly, systematically build a version of me in Audrey's mind that I barely recognized. According to Colton, I was a man living in the past, stuck in a cabin outside of Penticton, rattling around in that old place, unwilling to move forward since Sandra died. He said it with concern in his voice. He always said everything with concern in his voice. "We just worry about you, Dad," Audrey started saying, more and more often. I was never sure if the worry was hers or his transplanted. What Colton didn't know, what I had never seen any particular reason to announce, was that the cabin outside of Penticton was the least of what I owned. Sandra and I had spent 31 years building something real. I'd started a small commercial refrigeration company in the late 80s, grown it slowly, sold my majority stake in 2019 for a number I don't say out loud to people I don't trust. We had property. We had investments. My financial advisor, a quiet man named Paul who'd been with me for 18 years, called every quarter with numbers that would have made Colton's eyes water. I didn't live like it. That was a choice. Sandra and I agreed, early on, that the money was for security and for the kids, someday, not for performing success at dinner parties. I drove a 10-year-old Tacoma. I wore Carhartt. I was happy. To Colton, I was a retired nobody who smelled faintly of wood smoke. He was not subtle about it. Not once he got comfortable. The comments came in small packages, offhand things. "Dad, you really should look into having someone manage that property. I know a guy if you need a referral," said the way people say things to old folks who need help with their phones. "Audrey tells me you're still doing your own firewood. At your age, that seems like a lot." At your age, doing particular work. At our son's first birthday party, Audrey and Colton's boy, my grandson Felix, Colton introduced me to his colleague from work as Audrey's dad, the retired handyman. I had employed 42 people at peak. I'd signed a deal in 2019 that my accountant had described as generational. But I said nothing. I smiled at the colleague, shook his hand, asked him about his work. Audrey didn't correct it. I told myself she hadn't heard. The dinner party was a Saturday in late October. Colton had recently been shortlisted for a regional director position within his company, a promotion that would have meant a significant salary increase and relocation to Calgary. He was nervous about it in the particular way insecure people get nervous. He became more aggressive, not less. He needed the world organized around his importance. He had invited his current director, a man named Stuart Barrett, along with Stuart's wife, to dinner at their house in West Kelowna. Nice house. Audrey had spent 2 days preparing. I had been invited because Felix had been asking for Grandpa Marsh all week, and Audrey thought it would be a relaxed evening. It was not relaxed. Stuart Baird was a large, quiet man with a careful way of listening that I recognized from years of my own boardrooms. He watched more than he spoke. His wife, a woman named Louise, was warm and easy to talk to. I liked both of them within 10 minutes. Colton was working very hard. I could see it from across the kitchen island. The volume of his laugh, the way he kept steering conversation toward his recent numbers, his team's performance, his ideas for the Western Division. Stuart Baird listened and nodded and gave nothing away. Then Colton walked Stuart over to where I was standing near the window with a glass of BC Pinot Gris. Actually quite good. I'll say that for Colton, he knew wine, and said with that easy smile, "Stuart, this is Audrey's dad. He's been retired for a while now. Doesn't really do much anymore. Just kind of putters around his property up in Penticton." He actually laughed a little. A gentle, isn't that charming laugh. Stuart Baird looked at me. I looked back. "Marshall Webb," I said, and shook his hand. Something crossed Stuart Baird's face. I wasn't sure what it was yet. "Stuart Baird," he said. "You said Webb?" "That's right." He tilted his head slightly. "You're not... Did you have a company? Commercial refrigeration? Out of the Okanagan?" I said yes. I told him the name. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I followed that sale in 2019. We were actually considering a competing bid at one point, different division that didn't go anywhere, but I remember the name. That was a serious operation." Colton had gone very still beside us. "It kept us busy," I said. Stuart Baird smiled. It was a real smile, not a dinner party one. "Colton," he said, turning to his employee, "you've been sitting on this?" Colton made a sound that wasn't quite a word. "Your father-in-law built Webb Refrigeration." Stuart said it almost to himself, like he was confirming something. Then he looked back at me. "I'd love to hear about the transition out. We're actually in the middle of something structurally similar right now, and I could use a perspective from someone who's actually been through it." And just like that, Stuart Baird turned his back to Colton and started talking to me. We talked for nearly 40 minutes. Louise joined us after a while. We moved to the living room without really deciding to. Audrey drifted over, cautious at first, then more settled as she watched her boss's boss lean forward in genuine interest while her father talked about supply chain decisions and exit strategy and what he wished he'd known at 40. Colton served dinner. He did it quietly without his usual orchestration. I noticed Audrey noticing that. After dinner, when Stuart and Louise had said their warmth good nights and the door had closed behind them, there was a particular quality to the silence in the front hallway. Colton walked past me into the kitchen. I heard the water run, then stop, then run again. Audrey stood in the hallway with her arms crossed, not looking at me directly. "I didn't know Stuart knew who you were," she said. "I didn't either," I said honestly. You never told us about the sale. I was quiet for a moment. Felix had fallen asleep on the couch, one sock half off, the way kids do. I looked at him before I answered. You never asked about my work, sweetheart, I said. Not unkindly, just plainly. She didn't say anything to that. I hugged her, kissed Felix on the top of his head without waking him, got my jacket, and drove home to Penticton in my old Tacoma with the heater fan that rattled on the second setting. The call from Audrey came 11 days later. I was splitting wood. Colton was right about that part. At least, I do enjoy splitting my own firewood. When my phone buzzed on the deck railing, I let it go to voicemail. Then I listened to it twice. She was crying, not dramatically, the way people cry when they've been holding something for a long time and have finally given up holding it. She said, "Dad, I think I need to come and see you. Just me. Can I come this weekend?" She came that Saturday. I made chili, Sandra's recipe, heavy on the smoked paprika, and we sat at the kitchen table the way we used to when she was in high school, before the distance of adult lives made everything more formal. She told me things. Some of them I knew. Some of them I had suspected. Some of them were new, in ways that made me set down my spoon and look at the wall for a moment before I trusted myself to respond. Colton had been telling her for years that I was struggling, that I was probably embarrassed about my financial situation after retirement, that she shouldn't bring up money around me because it was a sensitive topic. He had told her that the cabin was a bit of a money pit and that I was too proud to ask for help. All of this was invented. Entirely. What it had done, I realized as Audrey talked, was create a version of me in my daughter's mind that required her to manage me rather than simply love me. She had been protecting my feelings about a financial situation that did not exist. She had been condescending to me softly for 3 years because her husband had handed her a fiction, and she had believed him because she loved him. "I should have talked to you," she said. "I kept thinking I didn't want to make you feel bad." "I know," I said. "I'm sorry, Dad." I reached across the table and put my hand over hers. My daughter is 40 years old, and in that moment she looked like she was about 12, sitting at this same table with her homework spread out and a problem she couldn't solve. "You don't need to be sorry," I said, "but I do think you need to start having honest conversations with your husband." She nodded. "And I think," I said carefully, "you need to trust your own observations of people, including me." She stayed the whole weekend. We took Felix. She'd brought him down to the lake on Sunday morning, cold as it was, and he threw rocks into the water with the complete commitment that 4-year-olds bring to everything. I watched him and thought about Sandra, who would have been standing right next to him doing the same thing. I didn't tell Audrey what I'm about to tell you. Stuart Baird called me on the Monday after the dinner party. Not Colton. Stuart. He got my number through a mutual contact. The logistics world overlaps with a lot of other worlds, as it turns out, and he called to ask if I'd be willing to have coffee the next time I was in Kelowna or Vancouver. He was putting together a small informal advisory group for his division, and was interested in my perspective. I said I'd think about it. What I was also thinking about, Stuart Baird was the person deciding whether to promote Colton to regional director. I thought about that for a while. The easy thing, the thing I considered for approximately 10 minutes, would have been to say something. To walk into that coffee with Stuart and, in the natural course of conversation, let slip something that would make him reconsider. I had enough. The retired handyman comment alone, the way Colton had physically laughed. I am not going to tell you I'm a saint. I thought about it. But here is what I have learned in 63 years, most of it the hard way. What you do when you have power over someone tells you exactly who you are, not what you do when you're powerless. Anyone can behave well when it costs them nothing. The real question is what you do when the door is open and the other person has no idea. I met Stuart for coffee in Kelowna in November, at a place on Water Street where they do a very decent Americano, and the chairs are comfortable enough for a long conversation. We talked for 2 hours. I told him about the build and the sale. He told me about his division's challenges. It was genuinely useful for both of us, I think. At no point did I mention Colton, and at no point did Stuart ask. The promotion decision, I learned much later through Audrey, went to someone else, someone who had apparently interviewed very well and had a stronger existing relationship with the Calgary office. It had nothing to do with me. Colton blamed me anyway. Of course he did. There was a difficult phone call. Audrey on one end, me on the other, Colton's voice audible in the background at moments. He seemed to believe that I had poisoned the well with Stuart. Audrey, to her credit, told him she didn't think that was true. He told her she didn't understand how these things worked. I heard that part clearly. I let it go, what I did do. And I want to be careful here about how I described this, because it was not malicious, it was simply honest, was have a conversation with my accountant, Paul, and my lawyer, a methodical woman named Dana who has been managing my affairs for 15 years, about the structure of my estate. Sandra and I had always planned to leave the majority to Audrey and her brother Colin, who lives in Halifax and is a completely different story for a different day. After Sandra died, I had let the estate planning sit. I hadn't wanted to think about it. I thought about it now. What I set up was not punishment. I was clear with myself about that, and I was clear with Dana. Audrey's inheritance was fully intact. Felix's education trust, which Colton did not know existed, was fully funded. Nothing was reduced. Nothing was withheld. What changed was the structure. Everything for Audrey went into a trust administered independently, not controlled by a spouse, not accessible jointly. Hers, cleanly and legally, and without any mechanism by which a husband with a particular talent for managing other people's perceptions could manage it. Dana drafted it carefully. She did not ask me why I wanted it structured that way, which is one of the things I appreciate about Dana. I signed it on a Thursday afternoon in her office in Penticton, accepted her offer of coffee, and drove home. I didn't feel triumphant. I want to be honest about that. I felt tired, mostly, and something else that was harder to name, a kind of grief for the version of my family I had hoped to have, the version where my son-in-law and I would have been, if not close, then at least respectful of each other. Sandra would have known exactly what to say to Colton. She had that gift. She could get to the center of a person and address it directly without making them feel attacked. I never learned that. I kept my mouth shut and waited things out and hoped for the best, which is a strategy that works fine in business and not at all in families. The following spring, something happened that I did not plan and could not have engineered. Colton's company went through a restructuring. His position was changed. Not eliminated, but significantly altered, moving him from sales-facing to an internal coordination role that paid less and carried less prestige. He was unhappy about it, more than unhappy. The stress of it changed things in their household. Audrey called me more. We fell back into an older rhythm, something that felt like what we had before all of this, before the version of me that Colton had built up between us. She brought Felix out to Penticton twice that spring. We took him to see the osprey nest down by the river that Sandra used to love. He was mesmerized by the birds and asked me questions I couldn't answer, and we looked up the answers on my phone together, huddled over the screen in the cold. On the second visit, while Felix slept, Audrey and I sat on the deck with tea, and she told me she and Colton were seeing a counselor, a couples counselor in Kelowna, someone her family doctor had recommended. She told me it was hard. She told me she wasn't sure yet what it would mean. I told her I was glad she had someone to talk to. I meant it. Were you angry? She asked me. Meaning, about everything. About the dinner party and the years of quiet diminishment and the handyman comment and all the rest of it. I thought about the honest answer. Yes, I said, for a while. And now, I looked out at the lake. The light was doing that thing it does in April, when the snow is still on the upper slopes and the valley is already warming, 2 seasons visible at the same time if you know where to look. Now I'm just hopeful, I said. That's all, just hopeful. She leaned her head on my shoulder the way she did when she was a little girl, and I put my arm around her, and we sat there until Felix woke up and needed something, the way 4-year-olds always do, reliably and completely. I want to say something to anyone watching this who has been dismissed by someone who should have known better. It doesn't matter what you've built, or what you've done, or what your bank statements say. People who need to diminish others will diminish you regardless. That part isn't about you. But here's what I've come to understand. At 63, sitting on the deck of a cabin that has more firewood than I'll ever need, and a lake view that I never get tired of, and a grandson who asks me questions I can't answer. The long game is the only game worth playing. Not revenge, not vindication, not the moment when the room goes quiet and everyone realizes they had you wrong, just steadiness. Doing what you know is right, trusting that the truth has a way of becoming visible without your help. Sandra used to say that the most powerful thing you can do is simply be what you are, consistently, without apology, and that other people figure out their mistakes at their own pace. She was right about most things. She was especially right about that.